Good evening. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 9. This is my second or third Wednesday in a row. I don't want y'all to get used to that. 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 9, and the message entitled Statute of Limitations. Now you law enforcement and retired law enforcement know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you that didn't pay attention in civics or don't remember, the statute of limitations are laws passed by legislative bodies in common law systems to set the maximum time after an event with which legal proceedings can be initiated. I started researching this a little bit, and the history can actually go pretty far back. I mean, back in Old Testament times in the Levitical law, you had something known as the year of Jubilee. So it was like every seventh year. And so there was unless you had murdered or raped somebody, you pretty much got a clean slate during the year of Jubilee. A lot of Israelis still practice a similar concept they call tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. And when I worked with the Israeli company for the 5 years I was there, the right before Jewish New Year was the only time at all any of them would ever apologize for anything, because they thought, well, this is the time of the year we apologize, and they pretty much would just come and say, I'm sorry for this entire year. Thank you. And then they'd walk away, And that was it. But you can go to the laws of ancient Greece, and the general rule was 5 years, again, with the exception of homicide. And it's funny, in the ancient Greek writings, the reason it was only every 5 years was the reason they enacted this law was to, as one of their Greek historians wrote, to control sycophants, which were people who were professional accusers. Maybe we could use something like that today, but that's a sermon for another time. So across the last, going on 13 years now, I've been standing in front of you preaching you guys on Wednesday nights. I have told on myself many a time. I can't remember most of them, but that's okay. None of you have ever let me forget, so that works out well. I tell these stories in part because they're funny, and in part so there's no mistaking me as some perfect or holy person, just another sinner in need of God's saving grace, and to give further understanding to why I view myself as God's joke on the professional ministry. So, however, I've told very few stories related to me working at the Homestead Steakhouse from 1995 to 1999, because before I started telling those stories and started preaching on Wednesday nights, I went up to Randy one night during choir practice and said, Randy, what is the statute of limitations for anything I may or may not have done while I was working in the Homestead? He looked at me and goes, there isn't one as long as I'm alive. So expect a lot of funny stories the Wednesday after his funeral. But until then, I don't have any fun story to tell that fits in with this. So let's get into 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 9. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, it is because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house, because he killed the Gibeonites. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. And the Gibeonites were not of the children of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. The children of Israel had sworn protection to them. But Saul sought to kill them in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. Therefore David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And with what shall I make atonement, that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord? The Gibeonites said to him, we will have no silver or gold from Saul or from his house, nor shall you kill any man in Israel for us. So he said, whatever you say, I will do for you. And they answered the king, as for the man who consumed us and plotted against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the territories of Israel, let 7 men of his descendants be delivered to us. We will hang them before the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord chose. The king said, I will give them. The king spared Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. So the king took Armoni and Mephibosheth, the 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, whom she bore to Saul, and the 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she brought up for Adriel, the son of Barzillai, the Mahalathite. And he delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the hill before the Lord. So they fell, all 7 together, and were put to death in the days of the harvest, in the first days, in the beginning of the barley harvest. So I have some good news for those of you that have been here since January of 2013. We're now officially in the home stretch of our 6-year plus study of the books of Samuel. Woo. There's only a few chapters left, and they're all going to deal with essentially the end of David's reign as king of Israel. And there has been some time that has elapsed between the end of chapter 20 and the beginning of chapter 21. So I warn you frequently when you're reading the Bible, in particular when you're reading Old Testament narratives, as we tend to read a passage like that, and that took a matter of minutes. You can read chapters in a matter of minutes. You can read 3 chapters a day in your Bible fairly easily in 20 minutes or less, which is why I encourage all of you to read 3 chapters of the Bible a day. It's a pretty easy thing to get in, especially once you get into the habit of it. And you'll be surprised at how quickly that gets you through the Bible, and also how much of it's actually going to stick with you if you devote just that 15 to 20 minutes a day to God, 10 in the morning, 10 in the evening, bam, 3 chapters. So we read that, and it happened in minutes to us. So we think it's one right after the next thing after the next thing. And it's not. It's almost better to picture some of the narratives more as like a highlight reel versus the entire drawn-out thing. So the days where he just sat there and didn't do anything would be kind of boring in a sense. And so this is going on. So it's important to note there's been a minimum of 3 years between the end of Sheba's rebellion in chapter 20 and this part of the famine. In chapter 21, there's likely was a gap of time in between the rebellion and the famine as well, but we know a bare minimum it's been 3 years of elapsed time. And so here we are, a famine has struck the land, and it's going into its 3rd year. We don't have a real good concept of this in 2019. Now, I can roll back in my mind talking to my dad's mom that I called Meme, and she would tell me how things were difficult, her growing up on the farm in eastern North Carolina in the 1920s and 30s, give or take. And she talked about frequently, if the crop didn't come in, you didn't eat. You didn't necessarily eat every single meal, and you ate whatever you had because you were happy that you just had something. And I vividly remember her telling this story repeatedly because it came whenever I wouldn't eat, and I was a picky eater, so that was pretty much every time I was down there. She would tell me this story about how she would peel a single potato and cut it up to make a thin potato soup for dinner because that was all that they had to eat. So again, the majority of us just don't really have a good concept of what it's like to famine because we ate abundantly and there's plenty left over, so please take it home so you can eat. That way you can save money instead of stopping to get something to eat on the way home. You'll have the leftovers. I know some of you are already thinking about what drive-through you're going to hit. I'm looking at Noah in particular because it's impressive he can sit here for an hour and not eat, right? But anyway. So, this is not during a time or place of food abundance. There's no food line. No sheets to go in and get, the amazing 3 fried appetizers for $5, which is a good part of this food baby I got going on. There's nothing like that. They lived in the desert. And if you think it's hard growing crops here, imagine you're a farmer in the desert. What are deserts typically known for? Not having any water. What's the main thing you need when you're growing crops? Typically, you need an awful lot of water there, right? And so, if the crops didn't come in, you got hungry. If the crops didn't come in 2 years in a row, that was pretty tough. The crop hadn't come in for 3 years in a row. People are dying at this point. And the king himself would be affected by this. Typically, as most things, when there's a resource shortage, the first people it hits is those without any resources. Those not as fortunate. The king pretty much always had an abundance of everything, but a lot of them will get to the point where this famine has even reached the king's house and the king's stores. So David wisely seeks God's help in the face of this chronic problem. Now, I imagine David was maybe a little concerned after the first year of famine and even more so after the second year. But the first 2 years doesn't make him pray. Third year comes around. All right, maybe I should start praying. This alone is a good enough takeaway for this lesson. If you block me out for the rest of it, you can take this and then pretend you're not sleeping. If I do see you sleeping, I just assume you're praying for me, so that works out well for both of us. That hadn't bothered me in years. But anyway, it reminds me a lot of my own personal struggles. I try, like my first go-to with any problem ever is me. How can I figure this out? Because I like to plan, and I like to have contingencies, and then I like a backup plan for the backup plan, and then I'm somewhere along plan M that involves Canada finally invading us, and this is what I'm going to do if that happens. And I'm like, man, I really just needed to change a light bulb. I think I've overdone this a little bit. But it gets to the point to where I'm reminded that there's absolutely nothing I can do about this. I can't heal people. I can't change people's hearts. And I turn to the Lord for assistance. And I always go, Lord, I should have started with this. And he's like, yep. So David turns to the Lord, and he gets an unexpected answer. The Lord answers, and it said, it's because of Saul and his bloodthirsty house that he killed the Gibeonites. So David goes, okay, bring me the Gibeonites. Brings the Gibeonites. They're like, oh yeah, Saul killed a whole bunch of us. In fact, he tried to kill all of us, but not quite. And they weren't supposed to do that. So it's what's interesting. This massacre isn't recorded anywhere in 1st or 2nd Samuel, but David doesn't question that it happened. So that means either he had knowledge of it or he had reliable sources that it was a thing. Since the Lord specifically spoke to David and said, hey, Saul killed a bunch of Gibeonites. That was good enough for David, right? So apparently at some point during his reign, Saul attacked and killed many of the Gibeonites, strung out across all of Israel because they were there living amongst the Israelites, and he was trying to eliminate the Gibeonites. So don't miss this. Saul is attempting wholesale genocide from a group of people that he did not agree with, that he did not think should live in his country. It's essentially the same thing Hitler tried to do during World War II, just to give you an idea of how atrocious this actually is. God frequently condemns actions like this throughout the Bible. But it begs a couple questions. One, what does any of this have to do with David? Two, what's this have to do with the country at large? Three, Saul was horrible to a lot of people, and we went through that in detail around 2013, 2014. What makes these Gibeonites so special? These are all fantastic questions. Let's go through some of them. So I read a lot of commentaries. I listen to a lot of pastors. I read a lot of theologians, both new and old, so I can get different points of view, things I might not have considered. And a lot of the theologians I've read have the general stance that people face this punishment because either they went along with it, they merely didn't oppose it when it happened. In the sense of the famous quote, all that's necessary for evil to triumph is when good people do nothing, or to quote James from the New Testament, he who knows the good he should do and does not do it, to him it is sin. And I'm sure that's an aspect of it in there. But I think the bigger takeaway here is, and this is the hardest thing for us to apply, especially in this day and age, none of us sin in a vacuum. Every action we take, sinful or righteous, has a ripple effect. Imagine literally everything you do throughout your day as throwing rocks into the surface of a pond, and it creates ripples. And then if you're throwing multiple rocks, you're going to have ripples overlapping other ripples. And all of us have to face the consequences of sin on a daily basis. We face the consequences of our own sin, and we face the consequences of other people's sin, which is what happens when you live in a world that is full of sinners. Sometimes these consequences are immediate. I got drunk last night. I woke up today. I feel horrible. Why is the light so bright? Why is everybody shouting? Why can I not let go of this toilet that I keep throwing up into? All right, some of these consequences we're unaffected by, and that you have to cover for that coworker that called out sick because, again, they were out drinking. That wasn't anything to do with you, but you face the consequences of those actions. Some of those are immediate. Some of those take a little bit longer to manifest without getting to a whole nother fun discussion about economics. Essentially, the mortgage crisis of 2008 didn't happen in 2008. It happened from stuff that happened years and years prior to that. That was just when it manifested itself. James deals with this in James chapter 1. James 1:14 and 15. He says, each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. He uses two different analogies here. One, when he's talking about lure, the best concept we got for that was fishing. You bait the hook, the fish is going to bite it, you yank him out, right? Lured to death. The second thing he gives is childbirth. When a woman gets pregnant, it's typically 40 weeks before they actually give birth. So it's a process, and it takes a while to get there. And so he's saying sometimes our consequence sin is immediate, sometimes it's further down the road. But either way, for whatever reason, God so chose this moment and this time, it's not for us to question. I know you want to. You're welcome to talk to him about it. But at the end of the day, in Genesis 50, Joseph was talking to his brothers, and they had beat him up and tried to kill him and sell him into slavery. And here, some 20 years later, he's finally above them and could enact revenge on them. But he doesn't. And they're like, but you should. And he goes, nope. He says, will not the God of all the earth do right? So he trusted God to handle those situations in God's timing. And because God took something horrendous as a brother being sold into slavery by his own family and used it to save literally millions of lives, which is a fun story to read towards the end of Genesis. And so David accepts that this is from the Lord and he needs to make it right because the Lord brought it to him to make it right. So David calls the Gibeonites and says, what do I do? What do I do for you guys? And they go, we don't want money. We don't want to wholesale slaughter Israel. And he goes, that sounds great. Let me know what you want to do. He says, we want 7 of his descendants, and we're going to hang them. And David goes, okay. So the next question, who are these Gibeonites? Why are they so important? Why is David essentially bending over backwards for the Gibeonites? Who are these people? They seem to be demanding a high price for something that happened circa 40 years ago. David heard it. When David heard from the Lord that it was an attack upon the Gibeonites, was the reason he faced this famine, I'm willing to bet a chill ran up his spine, even if he was in the middle of summer there in the desert. Because he knew his Bible history, and he knew these were a people especially wrong for Saul to attack and kill, for any Israelite to attack and kill. You see, in the days of Joshua, nearly 400 years before David's time, Israel swore not to harm the Gibeonites, a neighboring tribe. It's in Joshua 9. You want to look at that when you get home. God expected Israel to keep its promise. And some of you go, well, the Gibeonites tricked them into making that agreement. Doesn't matter. Saul's crime was in not keeping that ancient and important oath. This is another thing we struggle with, keeping promises. Bible's very clear. It says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, right? And there are those of you that say, if you're going to do this thing and be there, I don't worry about it. And there are those of you that say you're going to do this thing and you're going to be there, you show up, and I just try not to act surprised. I don't know who you are. Don't be that person. It's really annoying. But we make all these promises, and then we turn around and break them, and we see that in our leadership. We see that in our church leadership. We see that in our secular leadership. So we just don't think it's a big deal. And one of the things I try to hammer into my children is if you say you're going to do it, you need to do it. Otherwise, don't say you're going to do it. And I try to model that behavior as well. Anything I try to say that I'm going to do, I try to make sure that I get it done, and I get it done in an orderly fashion. Not I'll get to it tomorrow, and tomorrow never comes, so I say I'm going to do it. I just try to do it right at the moment I said I would. Otherwise, I don't promise it. And so now the kids have figured that out, so they're constantly trying to get me to say I'll do things, or they'll say I said I'll do things, and I'm like, nope. So now at this point with Madison, we're having to write things down and sign them and stick them on the fridge with magnets. I'm pretty sure she's going to end up being a lawyer at some point, but we'll see. But I'm as guilty of this too. In 1998, I was in community college, and I wanted a newer truck than the one that I had because I wanted one that occasionally would start when you turn the key. And in being super picky, I wanted one where the heat worked and the air conditioning worked, because the one I had currently, neither one of those worked, and it started when it felt like it. And so I begged and pleaded with my father, can I get another truck? Can I get another truck? Can I get another truck? Because my $4.25 an hour at the homestead just really wasn't buying another truck at the time. And I didn't know about financial peace yet. So finally, I'm like, I'll never ask for anything again, right? The ultimate promise you have to make as a kid to your parents. That's like your Hail Mary pass. And that goes, okay. So we go through all the deal, and we buy a truck, and I get a newer vehicle than what I had. It was only 2 years old at the time, and I loved that thing, and I was proud of that thing, and I kept that promise for 5-6 days, I think. That was at 18. I felt that was pretty good, and I went in my dad's office and said, Dad, can I have $4 to go to Bojangles, because it wasn't as expensive in 1998. And he goes, you said you would never ask for anything again. And I thought, well, I didn't mean Bojangles. I thought that was clear in any contract, right? So yeah, that's about how long it lasts. My dad laughed, and being the gracious, godly man that he is, he gave me $5 for Bojangles. But he reminded me every single time I asked for something for about the next year. I thought you weren't going to ask anything again. Look, my Father expects me to keep my promises. Your Heavenly Father expects you to keep your promises. Our Heavenly Father expects our nation to keep its promises. There is no statute of limitations on God's promises. Equally, there's no statute of limitations on the promises that you've made to God. Solomon was very clear, I believe in Ecclesiastes, he says, it's better to not make the vow than to make the vow to not keep it. And none of you like having that quoted back to you whenever you fail to follow through on something. And I hate having that quoted back to me every time I fail to follow through on something. Time does not diminish our obligation to whatever it is God has called you to. I don't know if any of you ever seen the movie from about 10 years back called Evan Almighty, where Steve Carell's called to be a modern-day Noah and build the ark. And there's this fantastic scene I like to show people frequently. It's right at the beginning. He's a congressman. He's important now. And God's told him to build this ark. He doesn't want to do it. And so God shows up. God, played by Morgan Freeman, shows up on the front lawn, and he runs him off. And so he tries to run away. And he gets in the vehicle, and then God appears in the back seat, and he starts freaking out. And he pulls over to a cop saying there's a carjacker in the car, and the cop is God. And it's Morgan Freeman again. And then he tries to take off. He goes, hold on, there's someone in the crosswalk. And it's God there in the crosswalk. And he's just seeing God everywhere. And then he gets there to Congress, and they're doing the Pledge of Allegiance. And he's doing the pledge, and he's finally calming down. And he hears the voice next to him go, one nation under me. And he turns and looks, and it's God. And he looks at Evan, and he goes, how long are you going to keep this up? I've got all eternity. And that's what it's like running from God. You're not going to outweigh him, right? He's got all eternity. And so David honors the Gibeonites' request. He brings the 7 men, 7 descendants of Saul, 2 from Saul's concubine, 5 from David's first wife through her second husband when he was in exile. That made Thanksgiving awkward, right? But anyway, and so David goes out of his way to keep his promise, spares Jonathan's sons Mephibosheth. Say Mephibosheth's people are off base, right? You can't touch them. And it says they were hanged on the hill before the Lord. I'm curious why he chose the people that he chose. I'm going to assume it's something he prayed about. I don't have any solid biblical evidence to that. My personal opinion is that these were people likely involved in one of the 2 rebellions, possibly in both of those rebellions, because descendants of Saul were always involved in the rebellions because they felt Saul's line should have still been on the throne versus David's line. Actually, that's 3 rebellions now that I think about it, since David has become king. It would make sense from a practical standpoint if you had to eliminate 7 people, you eliminated 7 people that were politically and physically a threat to you. But either way, the method of death here is really important because it's fulfilling the promise that God gave in Deuteronomy 21. He says, He who is hanged is accursed of God. These descendants of Saul bore Saul's curse, and so delivered Israel from the guilt of their sin against the Gibeonites. Later on, the same promise is used as a messianic promise for Jesus. Jesus died the way that he did. As the Apostle Paul would write in Galatians 3:13, it explains, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. I'll wrap this up with a story out of my personal life. There are people in your life that you need to forgive. Not because they've done something to you, not because they've sought repentance, not because it'll benefit you directly. You need to forgive them because God first forgave you. Secondly, there are people that you need to seek forgiveness from. Jesus warned repeatedly, before you come and make your offering on the altar, make sure that you've reconciled with your brother. Then you come and make your offering. Sometime in 2001, I got to live that verse firsthand, and I was praying in my quiet time, and I felt very, very convicted to apologize to this one particular person. And this was a person that I'd had a huge falling out with circa fall of 1997. We had been really close. We had been really good friends. And shortly after I graduated high school, we got in a huge argument that just spilled over into other huge arguments, and people were taking sides and all that other fun things you get in, all that drama you get into at 17, 18. And we didn't even have social media to facilitate this. So it took a lot of effort to have this argument with this person, right? So it all fell apart. We just stopped talking to each other. And then, 4 years later, I'm told I have to seek forgiveness from this person. I'm thinking, I don't have any way to contact them. I don't know their number anymore. I don't have an email address. I got nothing. And so I was like, well, God, guess I can't apologize if I got no way to reach him, right? And then, right after that, another friend of mine ended up in a position where they saw them literally every day. And I thought, oh, shoot. So I physically wrote out an apology letter and then left my contact info at the bottom. And I put the verse there, and I explained, I've become a Christian. I treated you horribly wrong. I was wrong on this argument. I shouldn't have treated you the way that I did. I hope one day you can forgive me. I'll be praying for you. And I left the information there and delivered it to the person. And they're like, did you give it to them? And they're like, yeah. What they say? You don't want to know. Fair enough. Yeah. And then about a month later, I got an email from them. And they said, I appreciate what you did, and I forgive you, and I thank you for praying with me. It turns out they had gotten a really bad medical diagnosis, and they were having a hard time struggling with it, and that letter hit right after that diagnosis, and I hadn't even told anybody else about it yet. And then I wrote back, I'll be praying for you, and that was it. I never heard from them again until a Wednesday night in 2013. They just happened to randomly be sitting about where Barbara was. And I got to talk to them. Got to let bygones be bygones, and they moved out of town at this point, but they had, since somewhere in between my letter in 2013, they had also come to know the Lord. And so it's just, you never know how God's going to use you, right? You never know how God's going to use you. So take that chance while you still have it to be reconciled with people you have to be reconciled with, because one way or the other, God's going to call an account for everything we've done. And just as a reminder, there's no statute of limitations on any of that. David Rogerson, you close us in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this evening we had, Lord. We thank you for the fellowship we've had, Lord. We thank you for being able to lay our prayer requests before you, Lord, and just give you the glory for all you do in our lives each and every day, Lord. And so we leave here, we just ask you to make each of us one so everybody will say, when they say yes, it means yes, and when they say no, it means no. That's that in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.